Hello and welcome to The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James. I am the actor.
And I'm Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer.
Here we go, Josh. I'm dying to do something crazy and erratic and spontaneous and just epically crazy right now. Just whatever it might be after seeing this movie.
I went like the opposite way. Like I'm so in analytical mode. This movie has made me think so many things about the art of filmmaking and the art of literature and our point in time and how it's different than any other point in time in the history of man. Like it's crazy. Most of the things that we talk about are movies that start as the germ of an idea and they expand out in a very patterned way. And this movie, it's a movie that's based on a Twitter thread. So if you haven't heard about it, the movie is called Zola, and it is based on a Twitter thread about a stripper's road trip from Detroit to Tampa that just keeps getting crazier and crazier as the movie goes on. And it was written as a 148 tweet long Twitter thread back in 2015, which is when you could only have 140 characters in a tweet. And so this real person, Asia Wells, her nickname is Zola. And so she started tweeting this story and kept it going for a few hours. And the result of that was this story in a different format than we've ever seen from any other movie that you've ever watched. So, most movies either start off as books or plays or treatments or short stories or whatever, but this used a different medium, and that kind of got me to start thinking about what are the different possibilities for art and how art can be formed with all of these new different technologies that are available to everybody.
It's a little unremarkable to me that it came from a Twitter thread. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I'm not saying, first of all, let me clarify my opening statements. The energy of this movie is infectious. You cannot just sit down and not feel it. And if you do, congratulations, because I could not. It had me going from moment one. It's such a breath of fresh air. It's so alive, and it's not an easy movie to watch. It is difficult in places. It is extremely well acted. We'll get there in just a second, but the energy behind it, and it's all behind the camera, and it's all behind the director's choices. So I don't mean to say that it's unremarkable that it came from a Twitter thread, but why not? We painted on rocks when we didn't have anything else to do. We ended up doing theater and traveling around. That's how traveling theater started. And then all of a sudden we put it inside and we used candles. And then the next thing you know, we had lights. And the next thing you know, we were projecting lights through film to capture. So it makes perfect sense. And if this is what the world of social networking is developing, I'm all about it. Because you hear so many bad things about Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and just how people hide behind their little icons and their little faces and emojis and all that other stuff. And I stay away from that as much as I possibly can. I like to see my friends' kids. I like to see what my friends are celebrating their birthday. With COVID, it's been great. You can check out people's page or feed and you know what's going on. Twitter, it's brutal. Movie Twitter is brutal. So I just kind of stay on the fringe of it. And if this is the positivity that comes from something like Twitter, I'm all about it, because this movie is fresh and it's alive and it got in me. And I have done nothing but think about it since. It's almost this kind of strange documentary feel to it.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we can pull any kind of positive thing out of social media nowadays is kind of amazing. And also the fact that it came from 2015 versus now, I don't know how it would manifest now, but back in 2015, I don't know if anybody had actually used Twitter as a storytelling medium. And there's a lot of, I want to stick with this, the Twitter thing first before we get into the movie, because I think just the fact that this source material came from a medium where Zola was actually interacting with her audience while she was generating her art. And that happens in different arenas. It happens in music and it happens in stand-up comedy. in some ways I would think it would happen in theater. Maybe like you might
Yeah, it's called
wait a little bit longer for the next line because there's a laugh break or something, that kind of a thing. But your next line is your next line. And I mean, you may be able to like drop a line, or maybe you're in a play that has a looser script, but I would think that in general, wouldn't you say that theater scripts are pretty locked down?
I want to know exactly what happens next, but then the whole power of the theater is to try to pretend like you don't know what's happening next. But that structure happens in workshopping a play. You take a play, you have an idea, and then you workshop it, and then you actually hear what people have to say. So it's not an immediate interaction. I think that you're right. A line is probably, you have to wait for a laugh or whatever. That's an immediate interaction, which can, when it's in the workshop phase, change the movement of the play based on somebody's. And they do it with movies too. They do, even though a movie is done, they do those test screenings. And if something's not working, and the very famous one is Fatal Attraction, they change the whole ending of that movie based on a test screening audience going, wait, what just happened? We didn't get any revenge. What's happening here? And so, without giving anything away, if people don't know that movie, so I definitely think it is intriguing that she's interacting in real time.
Yeah.
And so, but it strikes me as the type of thing where she has her thought, and what you or I say about it doesn't matter. The next thought is coming.
But the reason why that's important to me is just from reading as much as I've read over the last, I hadn't even read the Twitter thread until after I saw the movie. I kind of did that purposefully because I wanted to see the movie as its own thing and not go into it having certain expectations. And so I'm glad I did that. But then I'm also glad I read the Twitter thread and read the subsequent story behind the story type articles. Rolling Stone has a really nice article. I'm reading an Elle article about it. So they kind of both go through what actually happened, or, certain things that Zola may have embellished. And that's the thing that is interesting to me, is that she's trying to create an engaging story that is based in some sort of truth, but doesn't necessarily have to be completely true. She's not writing an autobiography. She's writing an engaging story that has all kinds of salacious details and insane, crazy off the wall experiences that are going on. And some of it's some harrowing stuff too. I mean, there's sex trafficking, there's prostitution. It is some serious subject matter, but she's able to get in there and make it funny and make it engaging. And as a part of that, she liberated herself from being specific and being completely factual, and that made a more engaging story. And it seems like from the interviews that she's given, that the interactions with the people in real time that were kind of retweeting or following her back or responding to her was giving her the license, the artistic license to move forward and be bold about that, which I'm racking my brain to figure out another medium that would be like that. The closest I can get is stand-up comedy, where you may go in with a certain premise, but then as you're moving through and as you're seeing what people react to, don't react to, you can kind of move and change and shape and completely end up in a totally different place than you thought you were going to end up in when you started that bit or that set or whatever. And so it's very rare, especially when you talk about literature, because I would think somebody, if you're going to write a book, you're going to sell it and people are going to read it and they're going to tell you whether they like it or not. But in this particular medium at this particular time, she was able to do something and create an art that was essentially not just her, but other people. And I think that kind of attitude works its way down through this whole movie. Like you said, the director, the acting choices, the cinematography, the score, all of it is, I think, kind of like built upon that basis, which is really cool.
Look at Good Will Hunting. I read the original script to that versus what made it to the film. And the whole He Stole My Line from Robin Williams, that was something he improv'd, and it made it into the script at the very last minute, and that script was 10 years in the making for those kids at the time. So I think, yes, this is a new way to do it, but it's really not that different. It's really not. So the amount of time before we actually see the product, just like seeing this film, is, I think, the same kind of process, just maybe a little more alive because it's happening on Twitter. That happens with books too. They go through major rewrites and editorial choices and publishers.
But I think the difference is there's gatekeepers. Those are gatekeepers. You have an editor that says, like, you can't do this. You can't have this chapter here. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. You have a producer of a movie that says, like, this isn't going to work. People didn't know what was going to happen next in this Twitter thread. And she didn't know what was going to happen next in this Twitter thread until she tweeted it. And there's a difference between like revising something and creating something. And I think that's the kind of the difference between a play being established and then going through preview, or a movie being written and then going through rewrites, is because it's a generation of art in real time. And it's not like she went back to the 56th tweet and revised it and then went on to the 142nd tweet. So yeah, I agree with you that Janicza Bravo, the director of this film, is, I mean, I have not seen her other movies. She's also worked at Funny or Die, and she's directed a bunch of short films. And so, yeah, she's been kind of around the block as far as like being in different types of art. She's been a stylist, like done makeup and stuff for people. And she's been there, done that with a bunch of things. And the best way that I've heard her described is she has an aesthetic. And I would totally agree with that she is an aesthetician. She's someone who has an opinion on everything. And I can tell that from watching this movie. And I get the same feeling that I get from watching a David Fincher movie or a Stanley Kubrick movie.
Yep. I was wondering how long those names were going to take to come up, because immediately I was like, and there's even in my impression in this film, there's an ode to David Lynch in this film. And I'm not sure if it's on purpose, but I was feeling a vibe and I was like, but her aesthetic is so unique, but you can tell she's influenced by a lot of different people. And I was like, well, she's definitely got the whole David Lynch thing going on. That's like the weird angles, and something about David Lynch in hotels and people dancing to weird music happens in a lot of his films. Yeah, and Wild at Heart, there's a couple scenes in that where it's like, what? Lost Highway, there's a whole sequence where it's like, okay. Then, and not to jump too far in advance, but since we're bringing it up now, there's the shot where they're walking around the pool about halfway through the movie and they pass a little person and he's sitting in the chair. And I thought, if he talks backwards, this is definitely a David Lynch thing. Yeah. And he doesn't really articulate his lines. It's kind of muddled a little bit. Yeah. And I think, I'm going to believe that's an ode to David Lynch because, I don't know if you ever saw his TV show and I can't think of the name of it all of a sudden.
Twin Peaks.
I was thinking of Fire Walk With Me, which is the movie. Mm-hmm. And he has the backwards speaking little person, which is very weird and just strange and just completely
Mulholland Drive. He's in that movie too. That actor.
Yeah. So if it's not, then I'm going to believe it is, because this director strikes me as somebody who reminds me of what it was like to go and see David Lynch for the first time, Kubrick for the first time. There's an energy. It's awkward, and I don't want to know those people in real life who are in this movie. I don't want to be anywhere near them. Zola, I would kind of like to hang out with because she's cool, the character in the movie. She seems to be honest and just right there with the truth, but I still don't want to hang out with her. Not really, because look what happens. But that's what I felt like when I first saw and experienced Blue Velvet and Wild at Heart and all of these Lynch films. And then, Eraserhead, which is, that's tough. So it also reminds me of Aronofsky. It reminds me of Pi. It reminds me of his first film. There's an energy that she's generated. So I can't wait to see what she does.
I'm interested to see why you said Aronofsky too, because this movie was shot on 16 millimeter film, and Aronofsky has used 16 millimeter a lot. Pi was shot on 16 millimeter. And Black Swan was shot 16 millimeter. So it looks grainier. That's the easiest way to kind of like see that. And that it's shot on film. It's very specific. And then there's a particular scene that is the opposite of film. It is shot with a smartphone. And it's when they're in the car and they're driving down to Tampa from Detroit, and it's pretty early on in the trip, and they're dancing and going crazy to a rap song, and I think it's called Hannah Montana, and it is, and the difference in what it looks like, it's so pristine and so high resolution, and the colors are different, so you get that kind of a switch, and that kind of a, I mean, it is a feeling of something that they would potentially post to Twitter or something like that, that they're generating content, and that this is what this is for. And then it's a definite switch from that to the next few scenes where Zola kind of realizes, 15 hours into this trip, that like, maybe I shouldn't have come on this trip right after just meeting this person a day before. So that kind of switch in tone is good too. And it utilizes the technology of the film versus digital to do that. And that's really cool that Janixa Bravo is able to, throughout the film, she's picking certain things, whether it's particular audio cues. I mean, whether she's doing something like they specifically do the Twitter whistle, that thing. And there's reasons why they use that. Just in doing a little bit of research on it, every time that whistle happens is when there's a direct quote or a specific thing from the Twitter thread that is either said or there's action on in the film.
Well, see, to me, that is brilliant. I realized what it was, and I just thought it was like a period or an exclamation point to whatever the scene was, or a thing to like jar your consciousness out of whatever you've been in back to whatever they need for you to look at, or she needs to, the director needs for you to look at, or screenwriter needs for you to look at, whichever way you want to put it. I didn't realize that was because there are actual things that to me is new. That, of course, couldn't have been done 20 years ago because, Twitter didn't exist and that sound didn't exist. And it's like when you see people texting in movies and TV shows and emojis and all that other stuff, all that stuff we're used to because now we do it. But can you imagine the very first time a TV show chose to do that or chose to use emojis instead of something, whatever? This to me is a way of art reflecting art. She's reflecting her own. That's really, really super smart. God, I almost cussed because that's so brilliant.
Every time there's an easy answer or an easy assumed way of doing things, Janixa Bravo does the opposite. And that's where you heard me a little bit wrong. It's the amazingness of FaceTime. But I said David Fincher and you thought I said David Lynch. But I agree with your David Lynch assessment. I totally agree with it. But for me, that's where I kind of tap into David Fincher, where it's like there's things that David Fincher does with new technology. He uses technology like CGI in the opposite way it should be used. He uses CGI to move some hairs on Rosamund Pike's head in Gone Girl instead of using CGI to do explosions. And so in the same way, I think that Janixa Bravo is using sound. Like there's a scene, it is such a small scene, but it's these scenes that actually just pop out to me and they just like suck me into a film. They just get to Tampa, and we're not doing any spoilers or anything right now, but they get to Tampa and they get to a motel that is not a nice motel. And you get the feeling as they pull in that Zola kind of tightens up and she's not sure what's happening. And then we go to a shot that's outside of the vehicle and they all get out. But when they do that, the sound goes down and all you hear are these two kids. They're playing basketball, not even playing basketball. They're just kind of like bouncing the ball and it's very rhythmic. It's a boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
And you could say that it's your heartbeat. You could say that it's just a repetitive thing that just grates on you. And it's also, I watched it a couple of times actually, and it's not specifically metronomic, but it's not metronomic. Like the kid is actually bouncing the ball and he's bouncing the ball. It seems like she must have told him like, try to bounce it in the same way every time, but then also don't do the exact same. It's more organic in that way, but at the same time, it's still metronomic and it adds a little bit of like a spice of dread. And throughout the film, you just get a little bit more of a spice of dread. everything that happens, and it just keeps stacking and stacking and stacking until you get to the climactic part of the end of the film. There's so many different ways you can do that, but she decides to do it in a way that I haven't seen before, or that I haven't seen specifically like that before. There are obviously ways to use sound to increase tension in a film, but that wasn't even the score, which like Mika Levy is really, really good, and they don't score things very often, but when they do, it's amazing.
No, I agree with you. And I didn't realize at the time that that was going to set up a rhythmic pattern that I either didn't notice in the soundtrack before, or I started to notice after that moment, because there are things in the score that are so simplistic, but yet so powerful. And it's two notes repeated over and over again when they're walking through that corridor of the hotel or the other main big place that they go to. And they don't let up. It drones on and on and on. And the most kind of, if it kept going and you added a couple of notes, it would be almost 80s synth popish.
Yep.
You know, it's got this kind of Tangerine Dream. I don't know if you know who they are.
I've heard of them, yes.
Yeah, Risky Business soundtrack. But what the basketball represented to me was, I'm at a place where I guess I can't complain about noise because it's obviously late at night and these kids are okay with playing basketball in the corridor of this motel. And I guess I'm going to have to sleep through. Doom, 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 doom. So I knew it was a seedy motel, but I didn't know the movie was going to be where it went. I mean, in some way I was kind of in denial about it, because if I knew what I was getting myself into, I might not want to experience it because it is tough. Not as tough as some movies, but it's tough. So I just thought to myself, that would be the first thing I would notice, is that why are they right in front of my room also? Now, they don't know that that's their room at the time, sure, but they are right in front of the room at the time. And so I'm thinking to myself, I guess the earplugs aren't going to work at this motel. So I just didn't realize until you just mentioned it that it sort of sets up that rhythmic pattern for later on, because then it stuck out to me.
Yeah.
The whole score stuck out big time, and almost in a nervous anxiety comes over me when I keyed into it too. And where I would have to bring myself, it was funny because I sometimes wear my earbuds and sometimes I don't. Depends on if my father's watching something else, or it depends on if he's going to bed or if I'm staying up late. But a lot of times I don't, because I'm not really the biggest fan of things in my ears like that. I can hear my heartbeat, speaking of rhythmic stuff, and sometimes it's just distracting. But I didn't wear my earbuds. And I remember thinking halfway through the film, I'm so glad I didn't, because I am engrossed in this film. Without them, I can't imagine where my whole psyche would be hearing that on earbuds. I a little bit regret it, but at the same time, I think it was like a defensive safety measure that I took on, because that score is something. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was so cool because that act one, the first act, when Zola and Stephanie meet, it's specifically uses a xylophone for most of the score, the pieces of score at the beginning. And I think for me, the indication I got from that is it's representing a notification ding, like from your phone, like that. And that's all it is. It's a xylophone. And so somebody who has the default notification on an iPhone specifically, but they have the default notification sound on an iPhone, that's what you hear. And so I think Mika Levy used that as a springboard to kind of get into the feeling of what Zola felt when she met Stephanie this first time. And how can the score represent her getting to the point where she's willing to go to Tampa to strip with this girl that she just met. And then as the film advances, once we get into the second act, it kind of transitions more into like an offbeat harp. The harp is used a lot in the film. And I think that both that xylophone and the harp, it seems like to me they're kind of trying to show some sort of sense of innocence, like they don't know what they're getting into, because it's very feminine. The harp is a very feminine instrument, I guess. And as the film goes on, you get more and more, like you said, more and more electronic sounds, more synth sounds, more kind of low bass, and then synth snare sounds as the film goes on. And that's where I think that Mika Levy shines, is that this score doesn't sound like Under the Skin. It doesn't sound like Jackie. If you put a gun to somebody's head and said, who wrote this score? You might not be able to say it's Mika Levy, but you would be able to say it's specifically for Zola, in the same way that you would say that the Under the Skin score is specifically for that movie.
That said, if somebody said it's the same person who scored Jackie and Under the Skin, you would go, oh, yeah, it is.
And yeah, you're right.
Yeah, she's cool. She dresses really cool. She was nominated for the Oscar for Jackie.
For Jackie, that's right. Yep.
Interesting.
And so it's funny because like Steph and I were just watching The Rock, which I also think is a good movie. And the scene where Nicolas Cage chases Sean Connery, who's in a Hummer, with a Ferrari. And as they're going through the streets of San Francisco, I'm like, this sounds like a Hans Zimmer score. It sounded like Pirates of the Caribbean. It sounded a little bit like Dark Knight and Batman Begins. It just sounded like those movies. But it was The Rock. I mean, it was fine and it worked. He has some great scores. I mean, Dunkirk is a great score, and it's Hans Zimmer, but like he still also leans into specific scenes, and he may use the same sounds or the same structures, the same chord progressions for the same scenes in these different movies. But the way that Mika Levy is able to kind of either use kind of like what seems like found sounds or sounds that are integrated into the subject matter of the film, like that's cool stuff to me because it's a different way of creating. I'm going to let this thing affect me instead of me pushing that thing.
Well, I like what you said. Mika Levy, you might not know that this is a film scored by her, but it is a film scored for Zola.
Yes.
Like that makes sense to me that you said that. And it was interesting because when I saw the trailer and I knew a little bit about it, Riley Keough, of course, and you've mentioned this film for a while now, it just had this expected feel about it. I was expecting it to feel a certain way. Was I expecting it to be seedy? Yes. Was I expecting it to be dark? Yes. But I was not expecting it to be such, and I mean this as a compliment, and 30 years ago it would have been a compliment, that it is truly an independent film. It has this feel about it. And it's not that it wasn't made by a studio or studio's money's not involved and all that other stuff of the definition of independent film, because now independent film really isn't such a thing anymore because they are branched out from all of the studio projects. But 30 years ago, it would have stuck out because it has this independent feel to it. And by that, I mean its own sensibility. It has its own vibe. It resonates in such a, only this film could have done that. And I think you're mentioning that this is the score for Zola. The story makes sense because it's an individual sound just for this story. So the way that Janicza Bravo, I think only she could have brought this sensibility to this story because it's not the normal vibe from a story like this. We've seen these type of stories before. It's not like it's that original in its subject matter, but the tone and attitude and vibe you get it is definitely unique. And that's why I kept thinking of David Lynch. And you're right, you did say David Fincher. And when I said David Lynch, something rang in my head like that was weird. But I was so hell-bent on talking about David Lynch in this film that I think I just went right to it without even really hearing what you said.
It works.
Wouldn't be a surprise. I do it all the time in my life. But the point is that her thumbprint is strong. And it is all over this film. Some of the shots in this film are exhilarating. I mean, just the angles of some of the shots and some of the choices that they make. You know, how often do you see a man walk into a bathroom and go to the bathroom in a film? All the time. It happens all the time. Football stadiums, they walk right up to the trough and start going to the bathroom. How often do you see women going to the bathroom in films? Never. And the reason why is obvious. There's technically a different way. So how do you go about showing that? Well, here it is. It's in this movie. And I thought, did they decide to put that scene in the movie because you don't see it that often? That might be an okay reason. No, it's not truly. For me, it breaks down to character. It shows the difference of the two characters. Because Riley Keough's character, she doesn't squat. She's flat on that nasty ass toilet. Zola is squatting. And the way that the angle is, you see nothing, but you know everything. And to me, that must have been really technically difficult to figure out. How do you do this?
Now, there's three things in that scene. There's the squatting versus not squatting. There's the color of the pee, and there's the wiping versus not wiping, which we're getting real deep into this. But those all three things say a lot about both characters.
Absolutely. See, I was trying to be aware of what we were talking about. I want to show respect to the filmmaker, and I don't want it to be any kind of titillating situation.
That's
that scene, because it's not
titillating.
Well,
okay.
There's a lot of weird people in this world. I mean, there's a lot of people in this world.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people in this world who would be like, Anyway, the point is I wanted to show respect when I talked about it. That's why I kind of skipped over a few things. But you're absolutely right. I noticed all three of those things and the way that the camera goes back and forth, but it's still a very much reminded me of Wes Anderson, how he puts things center. She wastes no time. You're always talking about film real estate. She wastes no time letting us know this is the difference between the two characters right here. And that's amazing to me. And then it's kind of hard to talk about certain subjects because I want to have decorum in these conversations, but I also want to respect the film. So when you're talking about strippers, it's kind of difficult because we've seen them a million times all you have to do is watch The Sopranos. There's one every other 10 minutes, right? And then, Jennifer Lopez has done a stripper film. People do stripper films. It's an interesting world. But I don't think I've ever seen a stripper's routine filmed the way that they are filmed in this movie. And there are a few in the beginning, and then that's about it. Then there's one a little bit later on. Mm-hmm. And there's kind of like a montage sequence. But I think it's the shot when she's home doing the pole dancing at her place.
Yep.
And her behind is in the bottom left-hand corner of the shot. And it's the most interesting thing I've seen filmed about a stripper ever. It's so artsy and so thought-provoking, but it is a stripper's behind. And she's a beautiful woman.
Taylor Page.
Taylor Page. She is brilliant. Yes. First of all, let's talk about respect for great acting, first of all. Then talk about the shot. The amount of respect and the dignity that shot brings to somebody who does that for a living is enormous. But that's also character-based. It's letting the audience know that, yes, this is what she does for a living, but look at the art form of it first. And respect her. Look what she can do, because that's a hell of a workout. Like I can't even hold myself up on one of those poles, let alone do that in 10-inch heels. I can't even imagine in front of all those guys. But the angle of that shot blew me away. It almost took me out of the film because I was like, that's so original. I've never seen anything like that. And maybe it exists and I just haven't experienced it yet. But I'm glad we're getting through this topic because I wanted to talk about it, but I want to be careful because I want to be respectful.
Well, to me, I got something else out of that scene too. I mean, yes, she's beautiful and she's an amazing dancer. And Taylor Page did strip for 1 month in LA legitimately. Like she actually did it, not like just for fun for one night. Like she had hours and was an employee and all of that stuff. So she did that for research for the film. And so she's very talented at what she's doing there. But then that also shows you that, number one, she's installed a pole in her living room so that she can train. And number two, that it's more specifically so that she can train because her boyfriend is sleeping on the couch while she's doing it. 3, she's doing it without any music. So it shows you that this is less about engaging the audience in a sexual way and more about showing us what the character is doing at that time and why the character is doing that. Because the stripper scenes are titillating and the stripper scenes are meant to show you her in her element, Zola in her element, Zola doing what she does to make money. But then at the same time, we get to see the fact that she is serious about her job. Whatever you think about that job, she's serious about her job to the point where she put a pole in the middle of her living room. And on top of that, her boyfriend is so just either done with it, or it's not worth him waking up from his nap to watch her practice stripping. So that says things about either their relationship or just the fact that it has lost its novelty at that point in their relationship.
Well, coming from somebody, me, who's not interested in that at all, dude, wake up. Because you should be watching that.
Yeah.
Because if I'm keyed in on it, you definitely should be keyed in on it. But yeah, that's a good perspective. You're right. It's character based. It's very interesting because you're right. It shows what integrity that human being has for the seriousness that she takes a job, regardless of what the job is. You know, if she was an ice cream scoop, she would be taking that seriously too. It shows integrity. You're absolutely right.
So there's other things that Janixa Bravo does, like just the fact that, like, for even that same scene where she gets the text from Stephanie and the way that they go back and forth with the texting, you would expect in a movie based on a Twitter thread with people texting back and forth, you would expect there to be the little text bubbles up on the screen and you see what they're saying and all of that stuff. But instead, what they're doing is they're actually with other people in the scene. Her boyfriend is in the room with her and she's talking to her phone. So that is a little break from reality right there. And that's another choice that Janixa Bravo does. It's like, this is not a realistic thing. This is not the person in the film. This is not the character talking to their phone as they're texting. They're just texting, but it's the way for the film to tell us what they're saying to each other instead of giving the little bubbles on the screen, which everybody's done. They've been doing it for, 10 years, 15 years, ever since smartphones essentially that have been created. That's how these things have been shown on screen. But this is another way to do it. Also, they're being lit by the screen, which happens naturally, but that also shows you that their interaction with the technology. So that was cool.
I do want to mention that the opening shots of the film are amazing. The mirror, and them putting on makeup and them doing that kind of like single white female thing where they're imitating. You're not sure who's imitating who, but one of them's imitating each other. And then it reminded me of Nicholas Winding Refn in Neon Demon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so just the whole kind of ickiness of that world. And you knew you were in for a ride when it starts like that. And the way that she manipulates the camera so you don't see anything but the two characters in all of those mirrors. Really well done.
The other thing that I wanted to get into is some of the storytelling choices that they did in the film that were not in the Twitter thread. One of the things that she does say is it'll be 48 hours before I know this guy's name, when referencing X in the film, which is the guy who takes them down to Tampa. And that right there is their version of a Chekhov's gun, I guess, maybe, or a ticking clock that just opens up a flood of questions. And then right after you find out his name, after those 48 hours, there's another thing. I'm trying not to be spoilery. You meet another character who, this is like 2/3 of the way into the film, you meet another character and Zola says, it'll be 24 hours before I hear her speak. And so that happens right after the 48-hour guy's name clock ends. So they kind of like set the hook and then keep you going for each of those things, which is another way of keeping the audience interested. And it's something I haven't seen before.
Well, she does that with her internal monologues all the way through the film.
Yeah.
Because when X does say, you trying to do my job, you think you can do my job better? Yep. You hear the voiceover.
Yeah.
Yep. And she is speaking to us as the audience, obviously, but she's not narrating the film, but at the same time, she's commenting on it and narrating it sort of, but it's not your traditional narration. It's, hey, I want you to understand everything that she does from this point on, because up until that point, you're not sure if Zola is a reliable narrator. We don't know. We don't know if how this story is going to play out. We think she's the good person or the soul who's trying to do the right thing in the muck, in the mire, but we don't know that Stephanie is necessarily bad. And also, it's not, look what Stephanie's going to do. It's, from this point on, watch her. because not only is she going to completely lie and play me the whole entire time, but I didn't really know it. But this is the moment that it happens. I want you to know it. And it gives you a different perspective as an audience. So you're watching Riley Keough from that point on going, is she telling the truth? Is she lying? And it takes a little while to reveal who Stephanie really is, even after that point. You have an attitude tone from Zola in the beginning of the film about Stephanie's character, but it's still more she's a stranger, I don't know feeling. But it's not because
it seems like they're kind of smitten with each other at the beginning of the film.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But the narrator knows what happens.
Yeah.
So the narrator or her
future self,
inner monologue, her future self, her inner monologue is indicating to the audience that this is not what it seems to be. Although it's hard pressed to not believe what you're seeing because you have two superb actresses making the moments completely, utterly believable. So you want to believe that they are smitten with each other. But are they? Or is she setting her up from the beginning?
There you go.
It's hard to say. I mean, I think from this point on, let's talk about spoilers.
Let's do it.
Let's let everybody know. I think this is a film people need to see.
Yeah.
If you like movies for like an artistic vibe or a different vibe than you normally get from just mainstream films, this is going to appeal to you. But it's also a great popcorn movie because it has a lot of mainstream things in it and it's different than what other people are expecting. So just the vibe alone will get people who might not normally look at an Aronofsky film or a David Lynch film or even a David Fincher film. I don't know many of those people, but they might not be, I don't want to see that guy, he does all that weird stuff. They're still going to dig on this film because it's got an interesting way it tells the story.
Yeah.
Unlike most of these stories play out.
I'll just say, like, before we get into spoilers, like it is a rare dark comedy that we don't see as much of nowadays. And we see some, and there's some like off the wall comedies, but it's a dark comedy. And I kind of wrote down here, like, how do you get people to watch a movie about sex trafficking? And it's like, well, if you make it a black comedy with hyperbolic characters in extreme situations, you can hope that what they're going through may actually translate to the viewers. They may actually it may make it more palatable to be like, oh, I kind of laughed at certain parts because they were just super crazy. But then also this happens, like these things happen. And so just watching a dire documentary about, all of these women who've been, essentially held against their will, whether it be physically or emotionally, and made to do things that they initially were not willing to do, but now have just been acquiesced into. That's not something that somebody's going to queue up on Netflix necessarily. But you make an engaging story that has humor and is biting and it's filled with style, and maybe people might talk about it a little bit. So, okay, Taylor Page, do you have anything to say about her acting?
I could just ramble on and ramble on. And then you're going to make a concise 2-sentence analysis of her, and then we can move on. Because the language is very specific in this film. The rhythm of the language is very specific. It's like modern day Shakespeare, and people might laugh at me for saying that, and I understand why they might laugh, but it's a very specific pattern of speaking. And Riley Keough has a enormously specific dialect and cadence and all that other stuff. And so to be the voice of reason, to use certain lingo that's modern and Instagram-ish, to pull it off, I think would be difficult because I keep thinking about what it looks like on the written page. And then to think Taylor Page is the same young lady in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. And I can see the face and the smile, but that's it. Mm-hmm. And I can see kind of I don't know if sassy is the right term, but she's got kind of a
brash.
Yeah, but in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, there's an innocence to her. But I also think there's an innocence to Zola to a degree, but she knows right and wrong. So I'm trying to think that's the same actress. It's kind of hard because there are similarities, but they're not. And also, she's kind of the spectator of the film. Zola is kind of the audience. And how do you stand? Here's what got me. I was majorly impressed with everybody, and I was majorly impressed with Taylor Page. But then I started thinking specifically about moments after watching it. And I thought the very first time that she's in that hotel room and the John comes in and she has nowhere to go and she spends the whole scene with her back turned to them for obvious reasons. And yet you can't see her facial expressions, but her body is emoting. You know exactly what she's thinking. And maybe that's me putting it on and like interpreting what I'm seeing. But I actually think that she did like back of my head acting. You know, I don't know how else to describe it because I knew just a little bit of flutter of her neck a couple of times, and then of course the narration is she's great. You know, it's gross. Just the way she says gross.
It's a mess.
It is just the line reading is perfect. Yeah. You know, when she talks about Stephanie and what's his
Derek?
name? Is it Derek? Is that her boyfriend's name? Yeah. Nicholas Braun. When they ended up having sex. It was gross. The line reading is perfect. I mean, it could not be said any other way. So I could go on and on and on. And Taylor Page is the type of actress that you would go see Shakespeare in the Park and not know that that was her, because she could do something like this. And I believe she could. I believe she probably has had some form of Shakespearean experiences.
That's where Janixa Bravo found her. I think she was doing a play in Los Angeles and Janixa Bravo saw her. And Janixa Bravo is a playwright and a play director. And that's kind of where she started. It's one of the places that she started. I mean, she went to school and all that stuff, but still.
What was I going to say? Coleman Domingo has something to cling on to. He has that very volatile, strange accent that he
he's African, and so he switches into that African accent, which is so effective in the film. It shocked me. It just like rattles you.
He loses his temper so severely he forgets to try to hold his accent back, which is intimidating with just a regular conversation probably to his world, but when he's that angry, he can't hold it back. So he had something to cling on to.
That's supervillain level right there. Like, that's what a supervillain would do.
Well, I like him. And speaking of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, I like him. And I'm like, I don't want you to be this bad guy in this film because now you've tainted me forever because you're terrible. He's terrible. He's such a bad guy. Yeah. Riley Keough has something to cling on to. She has that dialect and that the rhythm is very specific. It's something to cling on to that can help you and indicate where your character goes. Taylor Page doesn't have any of that stuff. Not really. And so to be the voice of reason, to be the narrator, to be the person who is watching the situation and not involved in this, I think that's all really hard to do. You're right. That scene when they pull up and she sees the motel and she's like, yeah. She does not do much. She looks around and she's like, this is disgusting. Then she looks down. Kind of like when you're getting scolded when you're a kid and you don't want to look at the person yelling at you. You just look down, but yet you know exactly what she's thinking and feeling. So like I said, I could go on and on and on and on and on. I thought I was going to come out, which I do love Riley Keough. Don't get me wrong. She is on the vision board of people we will watch for the rest of our lives. Yeah. I thought I was going to be amazed by her, and I was. And she's also doing something in this film that made me go, I'm glad that you have that in you and you can be so different than what we've seen you do before, but I hate your character. So now I'm mad at you because you did such a good job. So I thought I was going to come out of this film and be like, these people, but Taylor Page is the one that I have nonstop thought about, not only as the actress, but as the character.
I agree. I think that from an acting standpoint, that, like I said earlier, she wanted to make sure that she was authentic in her portrayal of a stripper and understood what someone who did this day to day, what their experiences were, so that she could at least try to imbue the character with that feeling and be genuine about it. So,
it worked.
Yeah. And the same thing with Riley Keough being able to kind of go all in with a very, I mean, it's offensive, I guess, accent. I mean, she is talking like a black woman would talk. And so, yeah, that's
Intonations. That's the word I was looking for.
okay. Yeah. And so the fact that she's willing to, like, this may not be me, but this is this character, and this is what this character would sound like.
Well, it's interesting because I know somebody who talks just like her.
Mm.
And she's a white woman. She just talks just like that. And so for me, it's in my ear already.
Mm.
And I know this person, and she's a really good person, and she's just a sweetheart. It's just, where she was raised and who she was raised with, and just the intonations of the culture that she picked up from. And so I think that if you don't know that people like that exists, then it might be offensive what Riley Keough is doing. But one, it's consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And two, it does not sound like she developed that. It sounds like she grew up in that. Like her specific dialect sounds like it wasn't one day she talked like this, and then the next day when she was hanging out with some people, she started talking like that. That doesn't come across that way to me. It comes across to me like she's always spoken like that. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a problem with it because it sounded genuine to what my ears used to with a couple of friends of mine. So,
Okay. All right. Her character goes through a lot in the film, and I think that the movie moves you into some uncomfortable positions. But the most dread that I felt was when Stephanie was paid to be there with a bunch of guys, and Zola couldn't get any like bars out. She couldn't call anybody because their phone didn't have any signal. And then Janixa Bravo again does something unconventional. The one time that she uses an on-screen graphic that is relative to the technology that we're used to seeing every day, she turns down the volume of the movie. All of the sounds go away, and as they get quieter and quieter, you see a bar on the left-hand side of the screen that goes down like on a phone when you turn down the volume, and then it gets down to the bottom where it gets into the little mute icon. And so at that moment, you just feel like there's nowhere else to go. And then she kind of does a hard left turn. And then you see Riley Keough kind of look up the camera and be like, let me tell you how this woman and I fell out. And it was her side of the story. So the part that I thought was interesting and that I keyed on at the end was that you see her kind of like, it's a shot of her like on a bed with a spotlight on her at the end. And then you see some sort of like camera trick or whatever where it looks like they're closing some sort of a shutter or something, or like the scene is ended, or like the magazine of film is ending. But then you see her break character as she's sliding off the bed where she thinks that she's not being recorded. And so
yeah.
you can tell that in the movie that this character is doing this diatribe to try to save face publicly over Twitter or whatever the real thing was. But it was also a release valve because it was a humorous segment at the expense of Stephanie.
And I do love the end of that where she does kind of fall off the bed, or the film kind of goes, that's
it's
really
just,
well
it
done.
makes the rest of it, it puts the rest of it in its proper place.
It's smart.
Yeah.
I think this is the type of movie that you can't just do one podcast on. We're probably going to have to revisit it. We're probably going to have to do a year from now and revisit it, because I do want an excuse to watch it again. And it's not as hardcore as it was hardcore. And the scene that you were talking about in particular is hardcore. The way it's shot is just devastating, but it doesn't hold me back from wanting to see it again. The film is still calling to me. Yeah. I can't wait for it to finally come out again so I can analyze it, because there are so many things in this. And I do have one last thing before we go to the end. There is that shot of the hotel and it's a very cliche shot where you see the camera is up above the staircase And usually there's a spiral staircase that goes down or a
Mm.
square staircase, and you see the character shadows going down the stairs as you're going around. And usually it's a locked on shot, and it's usually from up above. I mean, they use it in the Batman films. He goes flying down one of those at one point. She does the exact same thing in this movie with that kind of 70s Art Deco corridor of the hotel, but it's shot from the side, and you can see the above walkway and where you're supposed to be seeing the character, and then you can see below it, but it's at such a strange angle. I've never seen anything like that. And do you know the scene I'm talking about? Do you know
Kind
what I'm
of.
referencing?
Well, there were a couple of I think it happened twice, like where it was Zola kind of walking in and walking out of the hotel.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you get that same shot both times, the going in and going
Yeah.
out. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just thought it was a really smart shot because it's a cliche now, and we've seen it before, but not quite like that. It's almost like Yorgos Lanthimos. Remember when you pointed out to me in The Lobster that Olivia Colman's character's face is cut off? You can't see her character's face in that one scene. And I was like, that's so odd, but yet so perfect. And that makes sense for that scene. That's sort of what happens in that hallway shot, because you can kind of see some of the character, and you sort of see her when she comes focused in a little bit closer, but really she comes walking into that shot before you can actually see
Yeah.
her in full body. So to me, I'm not sure what the interpretation of that is, but it's intriguing and it makes me want to see it again.
Well, it's framing, and it's either it's deciding to move the camera or to not move the camera. And that gives me a nice segue into telling you to watch the movie The Square. It may be the best movie of 2017. I just
What?
watched it. I can't believe we didn't watch it and talk about it incessantly, but it's some of the best filmmaking I've seen this decade. It's that good. It is a Swedish film, and it's got a couple Americans, Scott Elizabeth Moss and Dominic West in very, very small parts in it, but it's so well shot and it's so well done. Like you have to see it. It's amazing. Everybody has to go see it. It's so good. I think it's on HBO Max, but either way, I can talk about that movie infinitely. But at the same time, I'll give you another little like thing to watch the next time you see Zola, is that at the very beginning when Stephanie comes to the back of the restaurant and Zola turns around and she's right there, and it's just kind of like a two shot and they're looking at each other. When they transition away from that shot, it's a fade out, but instead of fading out optically or fading out in an editor like in a computer, what they do is they turn off each of the fluorescent light bays starting at the farthest away and then go moving towards them. So they just flip each of the lights off in sequence until the whole back of the restaurant is dark. And then the next scene it cuts to, and the lights come on in sequence, starting above them and then moving away from them. So it's just a different way to fade out and fade into a scene, but it's using practical lights. Other movies have done it. It's not something that has never been done before, but it's just one of those things where it's like, we need a transition. We need to fade. What are we going to do? Let's take the extra time to think about how we're going to move from this scene to that scene and what that means to each of the characters. And that makes it a little bit dreamier. That makes it a little bit more surreal. And that's what we're going for at this particular point in time. I didn't get to watch it twice all the way through, but I watched it like, I don't know, maybe I got about a third of the way into it a second time. I mean, I think that the movie is structured in a way that is a very, specific storytelling structure. You have act one, act two, act three, you have the tension ratcheting up, you have a main final ending scene, and then you have a denouement. You've got all of that kind of built in, but ultimately the movie just ends. We've been through some crazy stuff. Now we're going home, which is kind of, I guess, would be more like real life as opposed to the car blows up behind you as you walk away or something.
I'm glad you brought it up, because when I was thinking about it today, and I don't do a lot of note taking, but sometimes I do to try to remember some things that I definitely want to point out or something I want to bring up as a question or whatever it may be. I was like, how did the movie end? Like, I was trying to remember it. I was like, why can I not remember how the movie ends? And I was like, okay, I remember him in the room and him threatening to jump and then
he
him
jumps.
jumping, which I thought was brilliant, because just brilliant. And I was like, wait a second, is this going to, oh, that's right, they're in the car, and then you see them going over the bridges, coming out of Florida. It kind of ended like it was a road movie. Then I started thinking, well, is Zola getting out of this? Is she in this forever? What is going to happen? Is X going to bother her? What's going to happen? Is Stephanie going to manipulate the situation? By the way, Riley Keough, side note, does a great job with that whole like for my baby thing and has that sympathetic thing. Not for a split second did I buy into it because I know who she was, but man, if you didn't know what was going on in the movie and you turned it on at that point, it would be a powerhouse moment. But because you know so much about the character up to that point, you're like, yeah, right, I'm not buying any of that. Although she sells it big time. But it dawned on me that the audience is left to interpret what they think all of the characters' fates are. And Zola has shown such strength and resilience and intelligence that she found a way to get away from him at some point. She found a way to do that. I think the boyfriend, Derek, I think he dies of from concussion.
Brain damage.
Yeah, from a concussion. Because man, I can't imagine hitting that pavement and then you see him at the end.
Oof.
So I think the ending is brilliant because one, how do you end it? And two, it is somebody's life. So life, you're right, does continue. I think it allows the audience to come up with their own interpretation of what happens based on what we've already seen and know about the characters. It's like reading a good book. The characters just never die. They continue on in your own imagination. And I don't want to live in that world. I don't want to know those people. I don't want to be involved in, I don't even want to help them on the side of the road if they have a broken down car. I'm not doing it because I'm not going into David Lynch land.
Yes, it's much easier to experience these characters from afar in the safety of my own home. You're right. I'm not necessarily like, palling around with people like this, but it is interesting and engaging to see this. In some ways, it's simultaneously a funny and a sad ending, but then also just kind of like a, what did you expect type of an ending. But the end of the movie, you have an end title card and it says, and that's the end of that. And that's the way that she ended her Twitter thread. You should go back and read the Twitter thread. It's actually...
Yeah, I'm going to.
It's
I'm sitting here thinking about it as we speak.
It's different, but read it as a short story because that's kind of what it is. And that's the only way that we can experience it. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. It would have been interesting to experience a story unfolding in real time like that, where you don't know what the next line's going to be, especially when each line is only 140 characters. The closest I ever got to that was I read The Green Mile when Stephen King put it out as a serialized book.
Right. I was going to mention that they do that in the newspaper sometimes.
Yeah, and that's the closest I ever got to that world. I think it was like every week you get a new 50 pages of a book, and then you just keep going back and you're waiting for the next one. And I mean, there's TV shows are similar to that, I guess, but it's not as... I'm talking about literature essentially right now, which this is a form of literature. This is a piece of literature. And I think it should be held as a piece of literature. It just so happens to have been generated on a social media website.
Yeah, I think that if we could steer the course of social media into this indulging of the arts, then I'm all about it.
All right. Well, you can check us out on the web at actorandengineer.com. You go to facebook.com/actorandengineer. You can tweet us your own Twitter thread if you would like at actorengineer on Twitter. And you can find us on YouTube. Just search for Actor and Engineer Podcast. And we'll see you next time.